Hello again, everybody. This is James Bartley, and you're listening to Bartley's Commentaries on the Cosmic Wars. Today, I'm going to talk about what a zombie apocalypse may look like, how we've been prepped for the concept of a zombie apocalypse, how it may play out in real time, its relationship to the continent of Africa, how clues have been inserted into novels, into movies, etc., and how it ties in directly to the pioneering work of Jerry Marzinski and Sherry Sweeney when they talk about meth users and speed users hearing voices and the voices telling them what to do, etc. Before I talk about that, and it'll be a two-parter, I will also talk about how certain synthetic drugs play a role in this as well. And I'll talk more about that in the members section. First, I'd like to pay respects to the memory of a dear friend of mine, Mariana Flynn. Mariana Flynn was a pioneer in the Australian UFO scene. She ran the large Sydney UFO research group, and she put together a series of lectures. She was a pioneer, and in the early going, when she first took over the role of running the Sydney group, she had to contend and ultimately overcome, defeat the so-called old guard, quote unquote. The old guard was made up of a bunch of old farts, disinformation type shills, people who wanted to keep everything at the lights at the sky level. Oh, we've investigated billions and billions and billions of sighting reports, but only a few were generally regarded as true unknowns, etc., etc. These dwids wanted to keep it at that level. They didn't want to delve into the hardcore aspects of UFO ET research, which delves into all kinds of very dark areas, underground bases, what goes on there. And Mariana had to contend with all of that, and she would meet all kinds of resistance when she would want to bring speakers in who provided a different perspective other than the lights in the sky. And she had me speak for her on more than one occasion, and it was an honor to do so. And I was able to share my information. And she's also connected me with people who became subsequently dear friends of mine. Mariana passed away just recently from cancer. And it's particularly poignant to me at this point because I just had Catherine Hand as a guest on the show, and Catherine was also a friend of Mariana's. We're mutual friends. So Catherine, if you listen to the interview, she went against the allopathic medicine. She went against the notion of having her breast lopped off for a grade 2 breast cancer. She ignored the browbeating, the cajoling, the hectoring, the badgering of the oncologists. She did things her own way, and she ultimately overcame cancer. And, the fact that Mariana passed away from cancer and Catherine overcame the cancer, I know it's caused a lot of soul searching on the part of Catherine. I wouldn't call it survivor's guilt because she's got nothing to be guilty about, and she wouldn't refer to it as well, but she has told me that the fact that Mariana recently passed away has played on her mind a lot lately, as it has on my own. I've thought about it a lot. Mariana was such a wonderful person. When you were with Mariana, you knew you were in the presence of a higher dimensional human, a higher dimensional soul who came here for a purpose. If you looked into those wondrous eyes of hers, felt her smile, her warmth, she had the slightest South African accent superimposed upon an Australian accent. And Mariana didn't shy away from the hardcore issues. She and I talked about the soul harvesting, soul recyclement. We talked about all kinds of hardcore issues. She did not shy away from that information, and she knew all about what was going on the surface, too. She was well-rounded, didn't only just concentrate on one aspect of the field. She was a generalist in that regard, but she also was quite familiar with the hardcore aspects, both on the surface and subsurface. So we're going to miss Mariana deeply because she was a pioneer in the UFO field in Australia. And she really put Australian UFO research on the map, I must say, because despite all the UFO activity in Australia, despite all the MyLab activity, underground base activity, undersea activity, all the black ops that go on in Australia, despite all of that, from a research perspective, Australia was very much a backwater. And that was due precisely to this old guard of disinformation type shills, lights in the sky idiots, and their minions, who kept it that way for a long time. But Mariana broke through that, and she changed the dynamic, the nature of UFO investigations in Australia. And for that, I will always be grateful to her, as well as grateful for her warm friendship. And I know that wherever she is, she's looking kindly upon us, myself and my colleagues who are doing this work. And we have an ally, on the other side. So anyhow, I wanted to talk about Mariana Flynn and, give a shout out to her memory and everything she meant to UFO research, not only to Australia, but to the world at large. Okay, on to the zombie apocalypse. It came out in lamestream news several years back that law enforcement, as well as the Pentagon, as well as the CDC, Centers for Disease Control, have all written papers and have all done studies on what to do in the event of a zombie apocalypse. And if you look at the CDC report, it is put together in the form of a comic strip. And the protagonist is a guy, his girlfriend, and their dog. And, how they find out they're in the midst of a zombie apocalypse, what the CDC does about it. Surprise, surprise, CDC comes up with this wondrous vaccine to, combat the problem. Go figure. But it's written in a way that is very serious. It's written in a way and depicted in a way that shows what it would look like, how it would be reported in the media, how the zombie outbreak would spread. Interesting how in the comic strip put out by the CDC, the initial outbreaks are reported in the southeast, okay, i.e. Florida, the Carolinas. And that's interesting because, as I'll talk more about in part 2, but I'll also delve into it towards the end of part 1, Florida, South Florida in particular, has been the epicenter of the Flakka bath salts outbreak. And this is a drug. It's like they should call this drug the Hell Express, basically, because, and I think about that movie Jacob's Ladder with Timothy Robbins, and I think of some of the novels I've read. I read a lot of novels, techno thrillers, spy novels, that kind of thing. Novels written by people with inside knowledge of special forces, of the covert world. And they frequently refer to Africa and things out of Africa with a sense of foreboding and fear and trepidation. You listen to these people, these ex-SAS guys who write novels about Africa and what they've done, what they've experienced there. It's like you can tell that if they haven't personally had some strange, scary experiences there, they've spoken to people who have. And this comes out very clearly in their novels. And one of the things that have come out of Africa is cannibalism, is disease, is pathogens. And that all ties into this. And so in the CDC book, the CDC report that's put together in comic strip fashion, the outbreak is in Florida, of all places, where we just happen to have the epicenter of the Flakka bath salt outbreak. And this is a synthetic drug which can, for a while, you were able to purchase in a head shop, able to purchase in a store, right? very cheap. The flakka that's sold on the street is for like $5 a hit. So it's designed for the poor, it's been chemically constructed in such a way to basically open people up to demonic entity possession and gives them superhuman strength. And a lot of these concepts have come out in some of these novels that I've read by people like Robert Ludlum. Ludlum wrote the Bourne series, if you remember, the Bourne Identity. They made so many sequels of his original novel about, the Bourne Identity, about basically a Manchurian candidate mind control victim turned into an assassin. Well, Ludlum has inside sources, and they feed him things, and once you get past all the propaganda, this is the case with a lot of these writers, whether they're ex-SAS, ex-Special Forces, ex-CIA. Once you get past the propaganda, i.e., Syria is bad, Assad is bad, the Russians are up to no good, the Chinese are up to no good, once you see through all that, a lot of times, depending on a novelist, they'll reveal a lot of interesting things that are really going on. And it's in factionalized form. It's fact hidden in plain sight as fiction. Robert Ludlum wrote a book called The Aries Decision, and spoiler alert, it deals with this covert CIA program actually piggybacking onto other countries' covert germ warfare program, biological warfare program, and it's the usual culprits, the usual suspects, Iran, etc., etc. They're always the bad guys in these novels, along with China and Russia. But basically it has to do with utilizing a parasite that affects people's brains in Africa, and it causes them to develop superhuman strength and attack and kill people that they're directed to attack and kill. It doesn't make them go crazy and attack other infected people. They only attack non-infected people, and the whole thing's been weaponized. And entire villages have been destroyed and people killed, and the powers that be, the various factions, want to weaponize this parasite, refine it, and make it so they could create like armies of zombie warriors. Now, we already have armies of cannibal warriors, armies of child soldier cannibal warriors in Africa. The story is set in Africa. What does Africa have to do with the story of zombies? Well, it has everything to do with it, because it's possible that some kind of research has been done to cannibals in Africa, New Guinea, and elsewhere, but particularly in Africa, as a means to develop a synthetic drug that will cause people to turn into zombies, and also to be thoroughly, totally taken over by entities, by demonic entities, and I'll talk more about that later. Okay, let me break this down. First point, as I mentioned previously, the Centers for Disease Control and the U.S. military and law enforcement, not only in the U.S. but in the U.K., have trained for the contingency of zombie attacks. The Department of Defense actually went to the trouble of coming up with a CONOP, a concept of operations, if I remember the acronym correctly, and what it dealt with was a zombie outbreak, a zombie apocalypse, and people thought of it, oh, this is just a joke. No, it's real, they put it out. But in order to kind of dilute the message, they said, well, in so many words, they said, in today's politically correct world, we can't identify any named group of potential enemies or hordes that will be attacking and destroying the U.S., so we just decided to refer to these hordes generically as zombies, okay? Now, the fact of the matter is, the powers that be, the military in particular, have always worked on contingencies. They always worked on what-if principles. For example, we have the Brookings Institute report about the potential for mass global panic were it to be known generally that aliens exist. I'm talking about extraterrestrials. Aliens exist, that they're here, and at some level and in some way they're interacting with the human race. And the potential for mass panic, how everything that institutions and people hold dear would suddenly collapse into meaninglessness, right? And this was back in 1960. The Brookings Institute wrote this report, something like 196 pages, and they wrote it for NASA. And always remember, NASA is not a civilian agency. It's an arm of the Pentagon. It's part of the Defense Department, so-called Defense Department. Talk about an oxymoron. We also have the extraterrestrial exposure law written into the books in NASA. The extraterrestrial exposure law basically states that people who become extraterrestrially exposed, and that's kind of a nebulous kind of umbrella, it could mean anything, can be quarantined, to use the polite term, quarantined, detained, call it what you will, right? So these people, they live on contingencies, okay? These people in the control system. And then, of course, there's the Federal Firefighting Manual in the early 1990s. When was it? 1992? Something like that. Anyway, it talked about, an entire chapter was devoted to dealing with crashed alien spacecraft and the dangers of radiation, radiological effects, etc., right? So, and there's a lot of clowns out there that just think that the whole concept of UFOs and aliens is nonsense. So, if you take it from that standpoint, that, okay, well, we know, or a lot of us know anyway, that aliens and UFOs and ETs are not nonsense. It's real enough to us, especially those of us who've had to deal with the situation and had experiences of our own and have done the research. And then when you look at the concept of zombies, and when you think about the information that's come out of Haiti, that's come out of Africa, about voodoo, about corpses coming back to life, etc., and how that theme is universal throughout, not just Africa, but throughout Europe and Asia and all over the world, really, this concept of the undead. So if you look at it from that standpoint, it's not so far-fetched. And then when I lay out what I mean by zombies and what I believe the powers that be mean by zombies, you'll see what I mean. So they're all into contingencies, planning for any contingencies, be it extraterrestrial, be it zombies, okay? Also keep in mind the concept of organic portals that Tom Montauk talks about, discusses. Organic portals, beings, humanoids, people who are essentially portals for extremely negative entities and negative energies. And also, I alluded earlier to voodoo and black magic. Always remember the classic book Darkness Over Tibet, written by Theodore Elion, where he had this encounter in this underground forbidden city with this evil Tibetan black sorcerer, black magician. And this black magician had like this legion of zombified followers and slaves in his underground lair. And it turned out, long story short, that this black prince and his minions, who were pretty much like him, were reanimating the dead by sodomizing them and utilizing the kundalini that they wield in a way to reanimate the physical bodily processes of these corpses. They didn't have much of a mind. They were just automatons. And it's relevant because in a document I'm going to read to you, the contingency plan from the military, it talks about voodoo, zombies created by magic, for lack of a better term. And before I read you excerpts of this Department of Defense Strategic Command document about combating zombies and dealing with the zombie outbreak, I'd just like to point out that there have already been a number of drills and exercises about epidemics, pandemics, quarantining people that are infected. And in these drills and exercises, they would take over schools, they would have all the first responders involved, the police, they would have federal, state, local agencies involved, planning for outbreaks and contingency plans for dealing with epidemics and outbreaks. I'm reminded of, I can't remember if it was John Rappaport or someone else, and he talked about how if they ever wanted to really push the vaccine agenda and make it mandatory for people to take vaccines, one way to do it is to create what appears to be and what is reported by the lamestream media as some kind of viral outbreak which causes known symptoms and causes nausea and other things, but in reality it's some kind of a chemical warfare attack, okay? Because that's germane to this discussion too. What certain chemicals do to the physiology of people, to the neurology of people, to the personalities of people. Another thing I want to mention before I start reading excerpts from this DoD document is this notion that, oh, this thing was written tongue-in-cheek. It wasn't really meant to discuss a contingency plan for an all-out zombie apocalypse. So, oh, look, the way it's written, it's describing like a fictitious place, right? That doesn't hold any water at all, because a lot of the contingency plans, a lot of the exercises that are conducted, they frequently utilize fake places. Like, for example, the yearly Robin Sage Green Beret training, where people that are in training to become fully fledged members of U.S. Army Special Forces, they take part in an exercise in what they call Pineland, where they're tasked with the classic Green Beret mission of leading and training and fighting with guerrilla units behind enemy lines, right? And in this yearly exercise, the country that they're fighting in is really forest, like in North Carolina. But the country, the made-up country, is called Pineland. And another thing that's similar is the urban warrior training drills, which a lot of service-level types were having like a nervous breakdown over, and probably for good reason, because the U.S. Marines, and remember the U.S. Marines are part of the Naval Service and therefore exempt from posse comitatus, which was geared up towards the Army. And urban warrior featured in drills all across the U.S. The U.S. Marines conducting house-to-house searches, setting up roadblocks, detaining civilians, etc., etc. And in the message traffic and the actual operational orders, they use fictitious names for places. Now, these places were real places like Oakland, California, on the ground in places like Oakland and elsewhere throughout the U.S. when they conducted urban warrior, rather. The Marines were really there. They were really conducting drills and how to round up people and search for firearms and go house to house. That was really going on. There was an armed presence in the streets, and they were actually putting out simulated message traffic as well. So, and then there were stages of the operation. They would go from one phase into another phase into another phase. And just because in the message traffic and in the orders, operational orders, they made up some name to describe the operational areas they were conducting these exercises in reality, those places were real. Oakland and other places, right? So, when someone says, oh, look, the document really talks about a fictitious land where this zombie outbreak is going on, that's a red herring. It doesn't really mean anything, because the military routinely uses fake names or made up fake country names to describe the places where these exercises take place. And everything is done in real time. Everything is done as if it's a real combat situation. So don't let that throw you off, this notion that, it's not a real place that they're talking about, right? Robin Sage, the Green Beret training, is in Pine Land. And Urban Warrior, they make up names for the places where they're doing the actual drills at. Okay, let me start reading some excerpts from this CONOP, this plan. Okay, here it is. It's the Con Plan 8888. And here's a disclaimer. This plan was not actually designed as a joke. During the summers of 2009 and 2010, while training augmentees from a local training squadron about the JOPP, members of a U.S. STRATCOM component found out by accident that the hyperbole involved in writing a zombie survival plan actually provided a very useful and effective training tool. Planners who attended JPME-2 at the Joint Combined Warfighting School also realized that training examples for plans must accommodate the political fallout that occurs if the general public mistakenly believes that a fictional training scenario is actually a real plan. Rather than risk such an outcome by teaching our augmentees using the fictional Tunisia or Nigeria scenarios used at JCWS, we elected to use a completely impossible scenario that could never be mistaken as a real plan. So that's just a disclaimer. But also keep in mind what we've seen from law enforcement also, where they just gun people down for no reason on the street. They act all scared. They act as if the person bleeding out on the sidewalk or on the street is still alive. And then an underling cop, a lower ranking cop, comes and quite fearfully slaps handcuffs onto the dead person. And then they all back away, pointing their guns at the corpse. I mean, I've seen video of this. Poor black guy, his car stalled out in the middle of the street. And, like on a normal planet where, people would come along and help the poor guy. Instead, a cop shows up, a fearful, entity-infested female policewoman shot the poor guy for no reason. And then one of the cops came over, rolled him over. He was still bleeding out, slapped handcuffs on him. And then all, like 3 or 4 cops all backed away with their guns pointed down at the guy who was already dead. Okay, and there were numerous other examples where I've seen video where they plastic cuff or they handcuff someone they've already murdered. And I always wondered, what the hell is that all about? The person's already dead, Why are they going to the trouble of handcuffing the person? Now it's starting to make sense. Okay, let me read some more. Here is where it gets interesting. Zombie Threat Summary. Zombie Threat Summary. Conplan 8888 is designed to address the following types of zombie threats. Pathogenic zombies, PZ. PZs are zombie life forms created after an organism is infected by a virus or bacteria or some other form of contagion. Radiation zombies, RZs. RZs are zombie life forms created after an organism is infected by extreme doses of electromagnetic and or particle radiation. And we do know that such things can engender cellular molecular changes in people, in plants and animals, etc., etc. So that's not beyond the realm of possibility that excessive doses of radiation can cause mutations. Okay, the next category. This is a key point to make. Evil magic zombies. Evil magic zombies. EMZs are zombie life forms created via some form of occult experimentation in what might otherwise be referred to as, quote, evil magic. Okay, let me comment on this for a bit. The original meaning behind the root for the word pharmacy, the basis for it was pharmacopoeia, which basically means sorcery. And that's what we have today. We have these evil people putting together all these pills and then ladling them out to the public, pilling them up. And some of these pills really open people up for all kinds of entity infestation. I mean, just think about the information shared by Jerry Marzinski and Sherry Sweeney. Now, their information will become particularly significant in part two of this, because I'm going to start talking about some of the drugs that have been created that really, really open people up to entity infestation to the point where they have superhuman strength, doing crazy things, turning into cannibals, okay? I'll get to that. Evil magic zombies are zombie life forms created via some form of occult experimentation in what might otherwise be referred to as evil magic. The late George Andrews wrote a great book, Drugs and Magic. He also wrote earlier books, Extraterrestrials, Friends or Foes. And I knew George. We corresponded. I was introduced to him by Barbie Bartley, because George and Barbie were friends. They actually made comedy skits together. And George talked about the long history in the Drugs and Magic book. It was an anthology, basically. Every chapter dealt with a different culture around the world that utilized certain plant medicine, let's say, hallucinogenic plants, to commune with, interact with, become basically possessed by entities through the utilization of plant medicine, right? Indwelling, let's say, indwelling spirits and all that, indwelling entities. And that's what the plant medicine, the hallucinogenics, were utilized for since time immemorial. Intentionally so. Where some practitioners of a shamanistic bent, let's say, deliberately utilized plant medicine in order to become more closely attuned to non-human entities. Okay? So that's the basis. And then you have pharmacopoeia, then you have pharmacies, then you have meth, opening people up to entity possession, big time. Evil magic zombies, I'll talk more about that later when I talk about flakka and bath salts and stuff like that. Next category, space zombies. SZs are zombie life forms originating from space or created by toxic contamination of the Earth environment via some form of extraterrestrial toxin or radiation. I talked earlier about NASA's extraterrestrial exposure law. And there are many MILABs who have been, at least for a certain period of time, detained, right? We're talking about kidnappings when the military, deep black elements of the military and or contractors come along and kidnap people through one means or another. They've been quarantined. That's the extraterrestrial exposure law in action. Next category, zombie satellites can be classified as SZs. However, they pose no danger to humans unless they conduct an unplanned deorbit. Typically, zombie satellites only pose a threat to SATCOM devices like DirecTV. I guess they're trying to get funny there. Weaponized zombies. This is a key point also. Okay, this is something that's been hinted at by a lot of people, novelists with known intelligence connections, or who get fed information by members of the intelligence communities. Weaponized zombies, because I'm going to talk about. There's already cannibal armies, folks. There's already child soldier cannibal armies going around hacking people's limbs off and, eating people they've just killed, etc., etc. There was a general in Liberia known as General Butt Naked, believe it or not. And before he and his men would go into battle, they would literally kidnap a young child, kill the young child, and drink its blood. And they felt that it gave them superpowers, okay? What's happened in Africa, what's continuing to happen in Africa, is germane to this whole subject. Because we're already seeing not only this immigrant rape invasion that's going on, but there's already been reported acts of cannibalism where these migrants from Africa would kidnap and devour white people. In Italy, it's happened in France. In some African cultures, albino blacks are regarded as a delicacy, okay, by cannibals. And I'm not just picking on, the Africans here, because cannibalism has been practiced all over the world, New Guinea, other places. The U.S. and Australian troops in New Guinea actually worked with some headhunting tribes. And then you have in India and Burma, you have the British and American, what we would now refer to as special forces, work with Naga hill tribesmen, work with tribesmen that were headhunters, basically. The British in particular. The Americans worked a lot with the Kachin and Karen tribesmen, but the British worked with a lot of the Nagas, and the Nagas were into headhunting, right? The Kachin tribesmen would bring back ears to show General Stilwell how many Japanese they'd killed. Just divide it by 2, and you'll know how many Japanese we've killed, right? So this concept of utilizing proxy armies that were into cannibalism, headhunting, mutilations, etc. This goes back to the French Indian Wars, at least, where some of the Native American tribes utilized by the British against the French and vice versa. Some of them were into eating, cutting out the hearts of the people they just slain, and because they felt it gave them power, okay? The Iroquois were notorious for capturing members of rival tribes and torturing them and then eating them. Indeed, the easternmost of the Iroquois tribes in the Iroquois Confederacy were known by the Algonquins as Mohawks, and Mohawk in the Algonquin tongue means flesh eater. Interesting too that the Algonquin and other tribes thought that eating human flesh led to spirit possession or entity possession, and they referred to this spirit demon they called the Wendigo or the Wendigo, which would take over people who were flesh eaters, human flesh eaters, and compel these people to crave more human flesh. You think? I think there might be something to that, actually. Weaponized zombies. And I would argue that these organic portals, people who are going around as cannibals, and you can actually see video on YouTube. You have to sign in and prove you're an adult, and I'll talk more about this. You have those child soldier armies in Africa where they're holding up, a human heart. They've just pulled out of someone's chest, and they're about to eat it, right? And you have video showing these Liberian officers in these makeshift guerrilla armies talking about how, they would eat their enemies raw, okay? Weaponized zombies, back to the document. WZs are zombie life forms deliberately created via biomechanical engineering for the purpose of being employed as weapons. Zombie weaponization programs and supporting infrastructures are included in COEs to deal with these threats. The movie The Crazies exemplifies the most common type of WZ. Humans turn into zombies via exposure to toxic chemical gases. Okay? And another category, symbiont-induced zombies. Symbiont-induced zombies are zombie life forms originating from the introduction of a symbiont life form into an otherwise healthy host, a parasite, basically. This is exactly what Robert Ludlum was talking about in his book, The Aries Decision. Although the symptoms of symbiont zombieism is similar in most regards to pathogenic zombieism, the symbiont does not kill the host organism quickly or at all. However, there is no known way to save an organism after zombieism has occurred, even if the symbiont is removed. Okay, then they have a couple other ones which I won't read. Vegetarian zombies, chicken zombies, etc., etc. But what I've talked about here is the different types and ways in which the powers that be feel mutations of one sort or another can occur, right? But always remember the template, the basis for this zombieism in all of its forms is this latent, R-complex, reptilian heritage, reptilian genetic intermingling with the human race, which still manifests today. I'm going to talk now about Africa, the cannibal armies there, the child soldier armies, and also talk about how that spread to the Western world. And I'll read from an article. This is from Defend Europa. I guess they got Evropa, Evropa, Defend Evropa. And the title of the article is Cannibalism Outbreak, not 28 days later, but Europe in 2018. And the author is Publius on March 6, 2018. And this is under the category Migrants. Coming less than 2 weeks after news that the Nigerian mafia butchered and possibly dined on a young Italian girl, another horrific story of cannibalism has emerged, this time from the Parisian suburbs. 3 men were arrested on February 19th in Clichy-sous-Bois. Don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. A notorious no-go zone. A no-go zone basically is where any white person, first responder, doesn't matter, risk their life by going into these places because they've been completely taken over by migrants. After a back alley altercation allegedly over money resulted in pieces of a fourth man's ears and lips being bitten off and swallowed. The perpetrators all hail from the Cape Verdean Islands off the coast of northwest Africa. The ethnicity of the victim, due to typical French bureaucratic obscurantism, is unknown. While it would be tempting to dismiss these gruesome events as outliers, the preponderance of evidence out of Africa suggests otherwise. The Leopard Society operating out of West Africa, Sierra Leone, which I'll talk about more, Nigeria, the Ivory Coast, and Liberia primarily would capture and dismember people and share the flesh with each other, in the belief that they could absorb energy from the victim and it would strengthen them as warriors. Interesting how widespread that so-called belief is. In countries like Tanzania, the dismemberment of albinos and often integration of their flesh is conducted by witch doctors, and the deceased albino's limbs are sold as good luck charms. If you look at the Japanese Imperial Army sacking of Nanking in 1937, you saw a similar thing, where they were literally cutting out the vaginas of Chinese women and wearing them as good luck charms, and just all kinds of horrific stuff. You got to read Iris Chang's book, The Rape of Nanking, if you can plow through it. It's very difficult reading. In countries like Tanzania, the dismemberment of albinos and often ingestion of their flesh is conducted by witch doctors, and the deceased albino's limbs are sold as good luck charms. Ugandan dictator Idi Amin was very fond of human flesh. He wasn't the only one. There's a lot of African leaders that are cannibals. Ugandan dictator Idi Amin was very fond of human flesh, and the Lord's Resistance Army operating out of that nation and several others has been known to practice, quote, magical cannibalism. There we go again, the magical aspect. On October 24th, 1986, the self-declared emperor of the Central African Empire, Jean Bedel Bokassa, Emperor Bokassa I, stood trial though was never convicted of eating several people. In the years since, the Muslim minority has routinely been victimized by cannibalism in the Central African Republic. Forced cannibalism was common practice during the Liberian, Congolese, Sierra Leone, and Sudanese civil wars, but also the forced cannibalism happened in intertribal wars in North America, where like the Iroquois would capture people and force them to eat the flesh of their friends or relatives, right? From the African Union report on Sudan, the Commission found cases of sexual and gender-based violence committed by both parties against women. There's that reptilian misogyny at work again. It also documented extreme cruelty exercised through the mutilation of bodies, burning of bodies, draining human blood from people who had just been killed, and forcing others from one ethnic community to drink the blood or eat burnt human flesh. There have been several reports out of the Congo that the Mobutu pygmies are being treated as a perverse kind of delicacy, and I've known about this for decades now, because a friend and I, back in our San Diego days, were following up on the story because we kept hearing these stories about these poor pygmies that were having to flee for their lives because they were being preyed on by other tribes. It was some kind of a delicacy. There have been several reports out of the Congo that the Mabudi pygmies are being treated as a perverse kind of delicacy, and that these pygmies are typically eaten alive. Several South African men were arrested and tried last year for working with a traditional healer to lure women, rape them, and then consume their flesh. They allegedly fed this flesh to as many as 300 other people. Dr. Gwen Campbell, writing in the South African Medical Journal, notes that traditionally in South Africa and Madagascar, people would and often continue to practice two kinds of cannibalism. Exocannibalism, where enemies were consumed, and endocannibalism, where dead relatives were eaten to assist their passing to the world of the ancestors or to prolong contact with beloved and admired family members and absorb their good qualities. Endocannibalism is widely practiced in Burundi, and I'll include this article in the website, where deceased relatives are eaten in the belief that doing so will also allow for the ingestion of said relatives' hunting prowess. That's possession, basically. In parts of Kenya, like Tanzania, albino cannibalism is practiced under the belief that it will bring wealth and good fortune. Okay, that's basically eating, white pigmented black people, okay? Among the Luya tribe in Kenya, it is believed that eating the genitals of a young virgin will cure AIDS. It is believed that eating the genitals of a young virgin male will cure AIDS. In 2016, Eritrean human trafficker, the General Madani Yadego Mered, was apprehended carrying a cell phone that featured graphic images and video of migrants' executions and the consumption of their flesh and sale of their organs. Mered is associated with a substantial trafficking network primarily operating out of Africa and into Italy. Still not convinced, back in 2003, 11 arrests were made of, quote, black magic practitioners in Cameroon who had murdered and eaten the organs of 17 victims. 11 arrests were made in Nigeria in 2014 at a restaurant that was serving roasted human heads as a delicacy. Last year, a South African man was executed by police after he refused to stop eating a woman that he had decapitated. Also last year in South Africa, an uncle killed his 4-year-old nephew and made him into a stew. Teodoro Obiang Nguema Mabasogo, the resident dictator of Equatorial Guinea, has been known to torture political opponents to death and eat their testicles and brains. Cannibalism is of course not limited to Africa either. There have been recent reports of its practice in Syria, Iraq, India, Laos, Cambodia, Indonesia, Myanmar, and Pakistan, and we are all likely familiar with the long-standing Papua New Guinean tradition of exocannibalism, often witnessed throughout Polynesia. So in addition to soaring crime rates, acid attacks, sexual assaults, pedophilia, the erosion of cultural capital, plus bestiality brothels, and the depressingly regular little horrors like a Syrian migrant being detained for raping a pony at a children's petting zoo in Germany, we also have another benefit, quote-unquote, of diversity to add to the list: cannibalism. Okay? And I mentioned this before, but it's germane to the discussion. In my readings of special forces, special ops around the world, which I continue to this day, yeah, granted they're fighting this bogus war on terror, but I still like to keep up. And I've read accounts of U.S. special forces in Afghanistan where, as part of the Hearts and Minds campaign, they're told to ignore the fact that, on a whim, an Afghan man can just beat the hell out of one or more of his wives because he feels like it, right? And they're not supposed to intervene. It goes against the grain. You want to pull this guy off of this woman he's pummeling unmercifully, but no, you can't do it, because if you want to win the hearts and minds of the culture, that's how the culture operates. You let them do what they do, right? And one of the medics in the Special Forces unit, as part of the Hearts and Minds campaign, treating the locals of their medical ailments and whatnot, he kept coming across these Afghan boys with scorched feet. And finally he had to ask, how come all these boys keep coming to my clinic and the bottom of their feet is toasted? And then he was told by a local, oh, it's because they've been disobedient to their fathers. This is what they do around here. They burn the soles of the boys' feet for being disobedient. And I read another account of Australian SAS in Afghanistan. They're in a lying up position, hideout, and they're observing this Afghan village, which they think there's Taliban there. And then they observe, because it's hot, they've been in a hide site for days and days, and they're kind of bored actually. And then they watch as this 12-year-old boy starts to rape this, what was it? It was a pony, or it was a mule or something, some quadruped. And not only was he raping it, but he was abusing it, apparently with a stick too. Okay, so, and then there's the saying amongst Afghans where women are for having women are for having babies, boys are for having fun. And the reports coming out from the British Army, of course the British would say this, not the Americans, because Americans are too busy writing stories about heroism and, fighting the good fight, whereas, British soldiers with a little more gumption and a little more self-worth write about what they really see sometimes, right? Like drug trafficking on the part of their Afghan colleagues, and also pedophilia, where members of the British Army and officers were even talking about this and writing about this, and going public about this. We're talking about the Afghan National Police in particular, were particularly notorious for this, having these pedo parties where they would pass around little Afghan boys amongst themselves. And they were ordered by their superiors, so-called, to turn a blind eye to it. The point I'm making, folks, is some of these cultures are entirely entity infested. And then when you take them wholesale and you plop them into a place like Europe and America and Australia and other places, right? You're going to have a clash of cultures. And that's what the puppet masters want. They want these migrants running around committing all these crimes and eating people and whatnot, right? Now, before the end of this first segment, I'm going to talk more about Africa, okay? And I alluded earlier to the fact that when you read some of these accounts by these novels also, by ex-SAS members, let's say, there seems to be a certain fear they have about the continent of Africa. And you have to understand that these SAS guys in particular, and SBS guys, they go through grueling training. And they're trained to be self-sufficient. They're trained to be thinking soldiers. And there are things that have happened in Africa that they've seen or they've heard of from and discussions they've had with trusted colleagues. Something has shaken them. Something has scared them. Now, you look at places like Sierra Leone. It's just one example. But, again, you have these cannibal armies in Liberia, etc. But Sierra Leone I'm particularly familiar with because of the British Army operations there in the recent past. What some of these Sierra Leone guerrilla armies would do, they would go from village to village, and they would capture young boys, and they would force them to rape and in some cases kill their own mothers. And the Sierra Leone guerrillas, they had different names, the West Side Boys. Originally they called themselves the West Side Niggas, right? But then, Western, cultural political correctness, in the media, they changed the name to the West Side Boys, even though they call themselves, from what I understand, the West Side Niggas. And remember, American blacks, even in music and whatnot, call themselves niggas all the time. There's nothing even unusual about that. It's only bad when a non-black person uses the term. But anyway, the West Side Boys were notorious for this, and they were by no means the only ones. And the West Side Boys would go to village, and they would ask a question to the local villagers. Would you like a long sleeve or would you like a short sleeve? And what they meant by that was long sleeve meant cutting off a person's arm up, at the top of the shoulder. And short sleeve would be cutting someone's arm off at the elbow, and that's what they did. And these people were all into, like, magical witch doctor stuff, voodoo stuff. Right? They were all into ingesting human flesh and drinking human blood, and they would get all drugged out on drugs, and they would get all drunk on alcohol, and then they would go out and they would fight. And they would go around from village to village and compel young boys and young men to kill their parents, rape their own mothers, and if they didn't, of course, they would suffer a gruesome death. And that's how they swelled their ranks, okay? And they forced them to take part in cannibalism if they were not already involved in cannibalism. And this is who the British Army came up against in Sierra Leone. When the West Side Boys were running amok, and then they went and captured 11 Irish Rangers who were there as part of a peacekeeping mission. And then the British SAS and the SBS and the British Para Pathfinders had to go and rescue the Irish Rangers, including a corporal from the Sierra Leone Army who was a liaison for the British Army Irish Rangers. And you can read about this. It was called Operation Certain Death. That's what some of the SAS guys called the operation. It was officially called Operation Barras, Barras, but the WAGs in the SAS unit looked at the plan and said, oh no, we're going to change this one to Operation Certain Death. Because you have to remember also, okay, you wouldn't want to be captured by these West Side Boys because you might wind up getting eaten by them, all right? I mean, they had to do an air assault right into a Sierra Leone West Side Boys village, right? You got to read the story. It's interesting, but they knew these people were fanatics. They believed these West Side Boys and others like them in Sierra Leone and throughout Africa in these black magic voodoo armies, cannibal armies. They think they're impervious to bullets. They think that they can use black magic in their war fighting. They think their witch doctors can make them invisible. They think their witch doctors can make bullets swerve around them. Okay, this is what we're talking about here. This is a mentality of what they're up against when they're dealing with these people. And then you read some of these accounts by these ex-SAS guys in their novels, and they talk about black magic. They talk about some of these things that's been alluded to by their colleagues, okay? So I just want to use that as a backdrop, because in the members segment I'm going to talk about the spirit aspect of it and how it merges with the pharmacopoeia aspect of things, right? The ability to create pharmaceuticals, the ability to create designer drugs which open people up. Not just meth now, okay? We're going beyond meth. Meth and crank and all that was bad enough, but I remind the listeners of a great movie some time ago, Jacob's Ladder, starring Timothy Robbins, about this army guy who was pulled into a mind control project in Vietnam. Spoiler alert if you haven't seen it yet. It's a great story because it talks about how this army germ warfare unit, and when you're talking germ warfare, of course you're talking about Fort Detrick, U.S. AMRID. You're talking about the British germ warfare operation at Portondown, etc., etc. But increasingly, I believe the pharmaceutical outfits, these black ops versions of the well-known pharmaceutical companies are deeply, deeply involved in this kind of work. U.S. AMRID stands for United States Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Diseases. And you can see this depicted in the silly movie Outbreak, starring perps like Dustin Hoffman and Kevin Spacey, where they try to make it seem like they're the good guys, basically, when they do all kinds of wicked things there. Portondown in England, they've been known to conduct germ warfare, chemical warfare on human participants, let's say, or maybe subjects, or maybe just people just, and also what goes on, folks, is people are routinely used as guinea pigs in these bioengineering warfare places, and they see it as a end justifies a means. So there's no shortage of them to perfect their techniques. Okay, Edgewood Arsenal in the U.S. for many years, members of the military and probably civilians have been used in nerve agent trials and germ warfare tests. So it's well established that they do these kinds of things. And the basis for the movie, Jacob's Ladder, was the army wanted to make their soldiers more violent. because there was this feeling in the high command that the soldiers in Vietnam and around the world were too passive. And we've talked about this, how psychologists for decades, and this goes back to the American Civil War, they had to make soldiers more aggressive. There was too many soldiers not shooting. So in the movie, and I'm sure the basis for this is 100% fact, reality, they came up with a drug that the germ warfare experts in the army called Jacob's ladder, because it was like taking a ladder, they said, straight down to the most primordial, beastly part of their psyche, of their neurology, which we know is the R complex, okay? We know it was the R complex, that reptile part of the brain, and what it must do is suppress the frontal lobe. Because, folks, these entities are all around all the time anyway. Some of us have a better firewall than others. But these entities of all stripes are all around, constantly tempting people, constantly trying to manipulate people. If you remove that firewall, that spiritual energetic firewall, and especially the physical neurological firewall of the frontal cortex, the frontal lobe rather, the impulse control center, and if you make these drugs latch on to certain receptors or certain parts of the brain which act as portals that allow these entities to jump in and take over, right? So what happened was in this movie, they did these trials on these soldiers in Vietnam, and they turned them loose in a village, and they not only started killing the villagers, they started killing themselves. And they just went berserk. And then for years afterwards, the survivors, who were kept under constant surveillance by Army intelligence, Army counterintelligence, the FBI, you name it, right? They were having these horrific dreams and waking visions of monsters, of demons all around them, tormenting them, messing with them. Exactly what the people that are taking flakka are saying. That they're seeing entities, that these entities are talking to them, these entities are working through them, these entities are compelling them to do things. Okay? There's one woman who got on flakka and she started writing backwards, for crying out loud. And it was messages from these entities. Jacob's Ladder, you gotta see the movie. If you can find Douglas Valentine's classic book about the Phoenix Project in Vietnam, that assassination, torture, interrogation, essentially mind control campaign, conducted throughout Southeast Asia, not just in Vietnam. But Douglas Valentine talks about how there was a special unit, and if memory serves, it was particularly made up of American black servicemen, black members of the Army, and they were all mind controlled. Something was done to them, and they turned them loose village upon village, where they would just wipe people out. This was like beyond search and destroy, okay? So when you see things like in Jacob's Ladder, where they were just turned loose in a village and they wiped everyone out, and then they turned upon themselves, okay? There's a basis of fact that these special units were put together to just wipe out whole villages. When I talk about hearts and minds, talk about pacification. Find that book, Douglas Valentine, about the Phoenix Project, absolute classic. And also another book, which turned into a movie, I Am Legend, which became the basis for the original movie, which I love, The Omega Man, with Charlton Heston. And later they did a remake with Will Smith. And a similar story. Of course, the Chinese were blamed on this. The Chinese launched the germ warfare attack, and those humans that were not wiped out, the ones that were left over, all turned into zombies, right? Of a certain type of zombie. And Colonel Robert Neville was like the Omega Man, the sole survivor. He happened to be an Army germ warfare expert from Fort Detrick who was trying to come up with a cure, right? Little did he know there were pockets of survivors, some of them whom developed a natural immunity, right? Anyway, you got to see the story. So the story and the concepts of drugs, of germ warfare, etc., of turning people into zombies. And if you remember that within all of us, because we have this reptilian hybrid background from countless generations of genetic engineering and black magic interference and all kinds of other stuff, that within many people there is this latent kind of negative Wendigo type person or being waiting to come out if properly tapped into. So here we have these germ warfare labs and these pharmaceutical corporations working to put together just the right mix to bring out the worst in these people. And look at Flacca, like $5 a hit, and all these, directed at the poor, and they're taking it and they're turning into zombies. And you got to see some of this video. Anyhow, I'm going to talk more about that in part 2. Thank you for listening. This is James Bartley, and if you like what we do here at the Cosmic Switchboard, if you believe in what we do, please go to thecosmicswitchboard.com, sign up and become a member, and we'll see the members at the top of the next segment.